How dangerous can a library be? Well, pretty dangerous. Hi, I'm Woody Huffines. I own a nurse to go in McKinney in Frisco, Texas, and this is Tech for the Untechnical. You know, if I pull off my phone and I look at my news feed, there's a whole lot of computer security stuff in there, talking about security vulnerabilities, and there's a bunch of different kind of vulnerabilities, and we'll talk about that in a minute. First thing we need to talk about is I use the term library. I said something about a library the other day to a bunch of 20-somethings and got blank stares because I was talking about how a hard drive, if you delete a file, it doesn't remove the book from the library shelves, it just removes the card from the card catalog. You'd have thought I was speaking a different language, but that's another issue. The news out this week is there's a part of a library that's causing some security vulnerabilities. So we're going to talk about two or three things. First, we're going to talk about what kind of security vulnerabilities there are, how we find them, where we find them, and why libraries are important in this discussion. So, security vulnerabilities. There's a bunch of different ways that you can get security vulnerabilities. There can be malware where somebody writes some code that's intentionally trying to mess your computer up, or there can be problems in your computer operating system or application software that let people into your computer to do bad things, that they use those vulnerabilities to get in there. There's remote code execution, there's escalation privileges, there's a whole bunch of different ways of doing it. But the question is how do we find those things and how are they classified? Well, for the purposes of this discussion, we'll talk about two classifications, which are disclosed vulnerabilities and then zero-day vulnerabilities. Now, a disclosed vulnerability is where the software vendor finds out about that there's a vulnerability in their software that would allow somebody to do something nefarious to your computer. And when they find out about it, they patch it, they get it fixed in one of the patches that rolls out so that that is a hole in the computer security infrastructure that gets plugged up by a patch. And so that's a disclosed vulnerability that gets repaired in the process of the update process. The second kind of vulnerability are the ones that are called zero-day vulnerabilities. And a zero-day vulnerability is where it is being actively exploited in the wild, and that's how we find out about it. So the two cases, some cases a security researcher goes and finds a problem, say with the Microsoft operating system. And they call Microsoft and they say, hey man, you got a security vulnerability and it goes like this, and they explain what the vulnerability is. And then after 60 days, 90 days, they will disclose that vulnerability so other people can look to patch it, so that Microsoft, for example, has an example to fix that security vulnerability before the security researcher goes out into public and talks about that security vulnerability. With a zero-day, you don't have that opportunity because a bad guy has found an exploit, they're using an exploit in the wild, and that's how people find out about it, and then there's a catch-up where everybody's trying to catch up and get that thing patched. Now, the reason that these two things are important is the monetary rewards associated with them. There are bug bounty programs now where the software and hardware manufacturers, Apple and Microsoft and Google and all these people, they have a bug bounty. So if you find a vulnerability and you go to Apple and you say, hey, I found a vulnerability in your iPhone code, Apple will pay up to $1 million if you find a really bad resource escalation, no-click, take over the phone bug, up to $1 million. And there are a lot of people that are making their living now over finding vulnerabilities and disclosing those vulnerabilities responsibly to manufacturers who pay them money for finding those vulnerabilities. And it works well for everybody. So there's these bug bounty programs that if you find a computer bug and you sell it to the manufacturer or you disclose it to the manufacturer, they pay you and then they fix it and everybody's happy and drives on. Unfortunately, in the zero-day market, there is a market out there for zero-day exploits. If it's an exploit that hasn't been disclosed and an exploit that the manufacturer or the publisher is not aware of, and you're a bug guy and you found a vulnerability, you could use it yourself as a zero-day, or unfortunately, there's a thing out there and it's like a market for zero-day exploits. It's called Zerodium. And you can sell your zero-day exploits to the bad guys or the good guys, or, well, you're really not sure who's going to get it because you're selling it to somebody that's going to own that code. A little suspicious. So, what does this have to do with libraries? Well, just like the old libraries used to be that had books in them, a software library is a repository of information or a repository of code that people can use so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. So, for example, if you've got a new computer program, you got a Raspberry Pi, and you're trying to put a Bluetooth module in it. Man, there's a bunch of people out there that have written Bluetooth modules for Raspberry Pi computers or any other kind of computer, Windows computers, this computer, that computer. And you have a source code, and there's SourceForge, and there's GitHub, and there's a bunch of places where you can go buy a library, a program, and a lot of them are even free. So you can go out on GitHub and find a bit of code out of a code library in a bunch of different languages to solve a problem that as a programmer you're trying to solve. Fair enough. The problem is writing secure software is very, very difficult. Very difficult, as we can see by how many takeovers and problems and things that pop up that we have. Now, if somebody on SourceForge or GitHub writes some buggy code and then other people start using that code, since it's given for free or at a very low cost, there's not a bug bounty program. There's nobody out there with a deep pocket. So if there's a vulnerability found in the software library, that if you come up and say, hey, I found a vulnerability in the software library, you're going to get paid a lot of money for it. That's a problem because these software libraries are used over and over and over again by a lot of developers. There's a vulnerability out this week that is hitting the managed service providers. Managed service provider software has a JavaScript program that's in a JavaScript library that a lot of people have used, and now they've found a vulnerability in this JavaScript library. The problem is who owns that library and who would pay you to disclose that bug, and the answer is probably nobody. And since there's nobody that's going to pay you for finding a bug in a library, people aren't going out and scrubbing through the GitHub or the SourceForge libraries looking for vulnerabilities, because those vulnerabilities, if they want to be in a bug hunter program and say, hey, Microsoft, you got a problem, give me $500,000 and I'll solve it, or I'll show you what it is. There's nobody out on SourceForge that has written a random number generator program that you use in your IoT device that's going to pay you $1 million because they don't have it. Now, why is this a problem? Well, increasingly, as more and more code gets written for Internet of Things devices and computers and refrigerators and all this stuff that is now enabled in some networked computer way, those source libraries or source code libraries are becoming more and more important for manufacturers and developers to use, but no one's going out there and looking at them. So why do I want to talk about this today? Well, one of the pieces of software that we use got mentioned this week in a new library vulnerability, and some of our customers might have that library or that vulnerability on their computer. Unfortunately, the software we use is not one of the ones that has a big problem, and they've already rolled out a way to go look to see if it's on your computer and other things. But the bottom line is that as these libraries become more and more useful and more used, the problem is, as these libraries become more and more useful and more used, those vulnerabilities get replicated in the marketplace. So instead of having one piece of software that has a problem, say Microsoft Word, if that software gets used in several different applications because it's available for people to use, either free or with a new license, GNU, then it gets put in a lot of places. So one vulnerability could affect 20 different kinds of software or 40 different kinds of software, or in the case of one that we found on random number generators, like hundreds of millions of IoT devices. They were saying like 200 million IoT devices have a vulnerability, and we can talk about that later. Libraries. Code libraries are becoming a bigger thing for developers to use so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel, but no one's out there looking at those libraries. So it's important that you keep your machines patched, that you have automatic patching on. If it's a machine that's particularly important to your business or your home, it might be a good idea to have somebody manage that computer for you that's like got a phone like mine that's got 25 stories on it about computer vulnerabilities and keeps up with that stuff. Bottom line is, you wouldn't think about it, but libraries have become a danger to us. Not the big ones with books in them, but the little ones with software code in them. If you have any questions about this, give us a call at Nerds to Go in McKinney. I'm Woody Huffines. I own the Nerds to Go in McKinney. If you find this helpful, hit the subscribe button, mash the like, share it with your friends, leave us a comment, and we'll talk to you again soon.